Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're talking about how the European Union is on the move with new pacts on fiscal rules and migration. We're at a global political moment when populist parties are once again on the rise, but particularly in the European Union, clear evidence of that was in the recent victory of Geert Wilders in the latest Dutch general election. In sort of with this political backdrop, the EU's moved forward with two very important major reforms. First, we've seen the approval of the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. So let's dive into that properly, Brunello. What does that really entail, and what consequences will it have?
So what happened is that after the COVID crisis started, there was a suspension of the fiscal rules. That's because, by definition, the massive drop in GDP and the excess expenditure for resolving the crisis meant that all the parameters that we usually look at, the debt to GDP ratio and the deficit to GDP ratio, all those parameters were totally off the chart. So there was no point in keeping those rules during these periods. They were suspended with unanimous agreement. So that was somehow easy. Um, then there was the question of when to reenact them. And as soon as it seemed like they could be reenacted, then the war in Ukraine started. And with that, the energy crisis, which has its own consequences, including the fiscal cost of the energy crisis, because governments assumed some of these costs. So as a result of all these, for 3, 4 years, these fiscal rules have been totally suspended. But an agreement was made to reenact them from the 1st of January 2024, which effectively means becoming binding during the 24 year. Now, um, everybody understood that those rules were outdated because they were thought for a period in which deficits and debts were totally different. The world was different from what is now. So the idea is, okay, let's reform those rules, and if we don't agree on this reform, we'll have to adapt the old ones. So, of course, as usual in Europe, negotiations always finish on the last minute of the last hour of the last day, and this was no exception. So, just before the old rules were supposed to come back, they made an agreement at Eurogroup level and then ECOFIN level. Um, these rules are slightly more sensible than the previous ones in two respects. First of all, it's not just a discussion on deficit per se, but on government, to some extent, discretionary spending. So that's also a discussion on how the government spend their money, which means optimize the expenditure, making sure that it's not wasted. This is a good thing. The other good thing is um, governments agree in a bilateral pact with the Commission a path for fiscal sustainability, which effectively means a reduction of deficit and debt that is more gradual than previously and modulated, keeping into account the investment that needs to be made, for example, for the recovery fund, but also the consequences of the energy crisis, energy transition, digital transition, and so on. So it's a much more political discussion between a government and a commission rather than having, so to speak, pure arithmetic in play. Now, this seems all good, but clearly there are the so-called frugal countries in Germany and the Netherlands, of course, on top of them, that want something more automatic, something that is less discretionary. And so they put some safeguards. These safeguards effectively mean that countries with a high deficit and debt need to reduce debt by 1% a year and deficit by at least 0.5% a year, and also keep a 1.5% fiscal buffer for the bad periods, which means effectively reducing the deficits to 1.5%, which is somehow challenging or potentially challenging for some countries. So in the logic of a compromise, everybody wants something. But I would say that the Germans have won more than the Southern Europeans have. In this particular game, France kind of changes position. Instead of being the usual partner, so to speak, of Germany, they played a slightly different role because now they are also, France is also a high debt country. And so it came with different proposals. Nonetheless, Italy didn't play very well its cards. Instead of, so to speak, ganging up with France and tried to create a common front, he went his own way. He has his own demands, which were totally unreasonable and in fact were not accepted, so that eventually Germany had an easy way out in finding a side deal with France and eventually pushing all other countries, including Italy, to accept this deal between France and Germany. And what has France obtained? They obtained that these stricter rules would only apply more stringently after an initial introduction period, so to speak, of about 3 years. And if you think about it's 25, 26, and 27, this is just to get to the end of Macron presidency. So those fiscal rules will not be totally binding for Macron. And guess what? Also, the Italian parliament under Meloni will end up in 27, elections in 22, plus 5 years, 27. So France and Italy obtain that those more stringent fiscal rules will not totally apply until these governments are in place, which may sound like a victory, but they pose a huge onus on the future governments. So eventually, I would say that Germany has won by not much, but has won this game.
Yeah, and France is also the forefront of attention for another EU reform, the revision of its immigration rules and the new pact on migration and asylum. Tell us a bit more about this and how does this perhaps affect sort of domestic political development in some of these countries?
Yeah, I mean, we know migration is everywhere a huge political subject and will continue to be for coming decades. In fact, it's so much better if, from a normative perspective, if politicians, instead of looking 3 to 6 months ahead, as they generally do, could think about this subject for decades ahead and realize that this is a secular phenomenon that is not going to be regulated by just tweaking some regulations here as there. It's a huge phenomenon that needs to be regulated. Unsurprisingly, every country is trying to build its own rules. France has just adopted its immigration law, and in order to obtain the votes of the right-wing parties, the Les Républicains, let's not forget that Macron did not win the legislative elections after winning the presidential election, so he doesn't have his own majority in parliament. He needs to find votes on everything. He wanted to get the votes of the center-right parties, and in order to do that, he made the law even more stringent. And in doing so, then Le Pen said, "Oh, that's perfect. I like it as well." And she voted the law, and that caused the resignation of the more left-wing component of the government. One of the ministers coming from that side of the political spectrum. Because if Le Pen agrees with something, clearly Macron might have overstepped. So it was a very intelligent move by Le Pen. It was probably a bit adventurous for Macron to go that far, especially considering that anyway, all these rules needs to be seen in the context of the European framework. And in that context, there is this new pact on migration and asylum that has been agreed on. I wouldn't say is a massive step forward, but is a step forward. The biggest problem is that the Dublin Agreement, which is an archaic pact that says that immigrants should stay in the country of first arrival, or at least be registered there before moving, but that doesn't foresee any redistribution rule. So that has created the fact that either migrants come to the countries that they reach first, and typically are Greece, Italy, Spain from the south flank. On the east flank, we have seen Poland being exposed. We have seen the Romanians being exposed and so on. So there are so-called frontier countries that see a constant influx of migrants. And unless they keep these people there, then, and they register them, these people start going around the union, because in the EU there's freedom of movement. And so what has happened over the years is that countries just turn a blind eye, just pretend not to have seen these people, because otherwise they would be forced to be kept there, or if caught anywhere in Europe, be brought back in the countries of first arrival. This is the other element of the Dublin Pact. It makes no sense. So effectively, it just gives a huge burden on these countries that are most exposed to migrations. So the new pact foresees that there are potential redistribution quotas according to the size of the economy, of population, and country, and so on and so forth. And if the country refuses to accept those migrants, it still has to pay 20,000 euros per migrant not accepted. So again, then it becomes a question, is it better to get a new migrant, or is it better to have a fiscal cost of not accepting it? At least is this kind of balancing equation that the governments need to make. Again, it's not ideal at all, but I would say is a slight step forward. And so I would say Europe, which is an elephant that takes forever to move, has still shown that with the rise of populist parties everywhere and globally, but especially within the EU, we discussed about again the victory of Robert Fico in Slovakia. We discussed about the victory of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. At least is trying to react and prevent the further ascent of these comments.
I think it's a much needed reminder that some sort of elephant, just like the EU, this often perceived to be quite bureaucratic and slow to move body, can still enact sort of pressing reform when confronted with these existential threats, even in the backdrop of quite populist political movements domestically within some of its key member states. So certainly something to watch for the future. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.